It can seem contradictory to mix science and faith, but as we just heard, the two are actually very compatible. The church and our faith motivate us to discover the world we live in. To lend their perspective on the relationship between the two subjects, our Father Robert Spitzer, host of Father Spitzer's Universe here on EWTN, and the president of the Magis Center and the Spitzer Center, and Dr. Matthew Bunson, EWTN News executive editor and Washington, D.C. bureau chief. Father Spitzer, let's get started with you. We just watched a great interview with the papal astronomer. What does the church teach about watching the stars?
Well, of course, the church has been watching the stars for a long, long time. And indeed, they were doing it before Galileo came, but they cooperated with Galileo at the what's called the Gregorian University today, at the Roman College back then, and in trying to put together a series of mathematical propositions to observe the stars, track them more carefully. And so the church has been involved in stargazing for a long, long time, and developed many of the techniques that that have led to confirmations of all kinds of stellar observations. So it might come as no surprise then that the person who discovered the Big Bang Theory, which is now the most rigorously established cosmological theory ever, was a Catholic priest, Monsignor Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, and did doctorate at MIT and was a colleague of Einstein's and Hubble's. And yeah, he was a Catholic priest. That's the person who developed mathematically the first evidence of the Big Bang Theory in 1927. So
wow.
Yeah, the church has been at it for a long while.
Yes, the church has been at it for a long while, since the birth of Jesus Christ, when we were watching the stars for that as well. Matthew, let's break down some of what Father Spitzer said. The Galileo affair in particular has been used as a way to kind of position the church against science. Can you tell us a little more about that?
The best way to describe the Galileo affair, and I look forward to hearing what Father Spitzer has to say about this, was best described, I think, by Pope St. John Paul II. He called it an episode of mutual incomprehensibility. And what he meant by that was that there was a kind of misunderstanding. We had theologians who at times were applying something of a literal interpretation to Scripture. But then, and this is often overlooked, we have a brilliant astronomer and scientist in Galileo who was trying to impose his scientific beliefs on theology. So the two were at something of an impasse. And yet, as Father alluded, Galileo was long supported by the Church in his work, especially by the popes, especially the popes of that era who understood the significance of his work. And I would also want to give an important bit of credit to a doctor of the Church, St. Robert Bellarmine, who was an ardent supporter of Galileo.
Father Spitzer, how did we get to that point where people think the church and science are somehow in opposition?
Well, it probably started in about the 18th century, where various kinds of historical facts were used to kind of oppose the church. Galileo was the most convenient one because, as Dr. Bunson just put it, clearly there was a misunderstanding between both parties, and the misunderstanding led to a house exile of Galileo, which was thought to be unfair at the time. However, it was actually a very sort of lenient way of sort of, expressing disapproval of Galileo for publishing something that he had promised the Pope he would not publish until stellar parallax could validate it. So in other words, the heliocentric solar system, the sun at the center of the solar system, was at that time still a hypothesis. It was not a confirmed theory. And so the Pope said, don't publish this as fact because it's going to lead to, a great deal of consternation between the Protestants and the Catholics, the Protestants taking a harder line on the biblical writ. And so he said, you're going to really put me in between a rock and a hard place. Just wait until we can get stellar parallax to validate this. And Galileo didn't wait. he basically, boomed ahead, published it as a fact before he had any evidence. That would have to come about almost 200 years later, and with Bessel and so forth. And the key thing there is that he kind of broke a promise. He not only didn't have the facts in hand, he broke a promise to the Pope, and that, of course, exacerbated the problem. And the rest, as they say, is truly history. That was seized upon in the 18th century to make it look like an opposition between the church and science, and that was never the case. The church was always, perhaps, the greatest, if not a super great promoter of the natural sciences, even from the days of the medieval university, including the development of the scientific method itself. And as I said, the Jesuits at the Roman College were collaborators of Galileo until, of course, he broke that promise and basically called the Pope a simpleton, by identifying
which is never
the Pope
a good
with
place
that
to start.
Never a good place to start.
Matthew, so
Exactly.
then Father Spitzer, I think, is making an interesting conclusion. He's bringing us to the point of making sure that we don't think we actually have to make a choice. How do science and religion then, since we're not making a choice, how do they inform each other?
Well, Pope St. John Paul II expressed it beautifully when he said that one of the roles that religion can play, and this is especially true in the modern world, is helping to purify science from what he referred to as idolatry and also false absolutes. We're living in an era in which scientism is increasingly rampant, and science itself is being overrun by ideology at the expense, I think, of objective reality and also, of course, of the pure scientific method. So the Church, as John Paul stressed, as Pope Benedict XVI has stressed, there are obvious touch points between the two. And the two must coexist, and the two can actually inform each other. And as Father said, in the history of the Church, in the history of civilization, that the Church has provided through such heroic figures as Father George Lemaitre, so much of the scientific method, the building of civilization, everything that we see around us, we can owe in so many different ways to great figures in the history of the Church.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us today.